I'm your host, producer for the day. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, by the way, too. And don't forget to go to ipdphilly.org for more on Indigenous Peoples Day ceremonies and celebrations. A lot of that happening virtually, unfortunately, but they are still moving ahead. ipdphilly.org for more on that. Let's head into our pioneers in the environmental justice movement panel. We have Majora Carter. She's still with us. Gave us a very enlightening, informative presentation before the break. So we really appreciate that, Majora. Thanks so much. And let me also introduce our other roundtablists, our other panelists joining us here this morning. We've got Maurice Sampson, longtime legendary grassroots environmental activist and strategist, Philly-based, also a longtime unsustainable waste management expert. He's got about 30 years of experience in the environmental and recycling advocacy space. He's also an entrepreneur, and he's a volunteer chair for the Recycled Now Philadelphia campaign. How are you doing, sir? Maurice Sampson, thanks for your patience, too, in the Zoom waiting room earlier. And out on the West Coast is Professor J.T. Roane, founder of the Black Ecologies initiative. We had him on about a couple of weeks ago, and I said, you know what, he'd be perfect. He'd add a perfect perspective and voice to this panel. He's based at Arizona State University, a professor in African and African American studies, but establishing the Black Ecologies initiative with his colleagues, and he joins us here. Go to @JT Roane, R-O-A-N-E, on social media, on Twitter, for more insights and engagement there. How are you both doing?
Doing very well, thank you.
All right, excellent. Okay, great. We got James off of. Maurice, I'm going to start with you because we have Majora give us a fantastic presentation. I'm sure you heard much of it. But we're talking about leadership in the environmental justice movement. We talk about the leadership that makes an environmental justice movement. And so talk about how you define environmental justice. When you think about that, what is it, particularly in the context of what you do currently? Like, talk about that current role, how it contributes to the cause of environmental justice and what that means to you.
Well, certainly, and I should start really by saying, I am, what pays the bills is I am now the director of the Eastern Pennsylvania Clean Water Action Chapter, which is based here in Philly. It's an organization that I previously was on its board for 25 years. And I came here originally consulting because I work in waste is what I normally do. And they needed a director. So I came in as a consultant, and then while I was in that process, Mr. Trump got elected, and I thought maybe I should stay here for a few years. Activism, environmental activism, was something that at the beginning of my career, I deliberately decided not to do because I honestly didn't feel like arguing how much pollution is acceptable is a way to clean up the environment. Either you clean it up or you don't.
Right.
And, we have a system that is designed really that looks at clean environment as an argument. Depending on who the lawyers are, one day you're arguing and you win for the environment, and the next day you don't. And winning for the environment is not an argument. It's something that we simply have to do. So I had literally decided not to do activism, but to do what is now, it's over the years been called different things, appropriate technology at one point, and sustainability at another. But I picked waste because, you either do it or you don't. You either recycle or you don't. There's no ambiguity there. It either happens or it doesn't happen. So that's where I sort of focus my career work. Now, to answer your question directly, I have floated over the last 30 years. I'm part of the traditional environmental movement. That's where I grew up. I started in November of 1969 when I was 15 years old, and I very deliberately picked this as my career path. And I have to tell you, when I first got on it, the Malcolm X wannabes around the campus would all approach me asking why I was doing that white man's work. So it was not an easy place for me to stay. Those very same people came to me 5 years later working for the energy offices, excited to see me because now they wanted to figure out how to do their work. So I've been in the right place. Environmental justice, I think, was defined really out of the Church of Christ and the work that was done with the Toxic Waste and Race Report in 1987, and I hold to that. That report correlated the presence of waste and hazardous waste facilities the demographics with being located in Black and brown communities. I like to tell people that environmental justice was a term that came out of that. And that for me, an environmental justice organization is one that either is of or works for people that are in Black and brown communities. And I see a lot of appropriation of the word environmental justice in the environmental work that we see, but there are very few what I call real environmental justice organizations. I worked for a traditional environmental organization. I have an environmental justice project that I do, where I have hired someone, a young woman, Quinita Kendrick, who has her background in public health, who runs my environmental justice work. And that work is focused on the Black and brown community. One of my missions at Clean Water has been, what is the role of a traditional environmental organization in working with the Black and brown community? That's been my focus here in Philly. We started with lead, and we are now going to pivot and work with water because silly me, I thought that lead was how I talked to people in the community of color. And when I surveyed them after doing the work for 2 years, they said, Maurice, we want to know about the environmental issues. Climate change is here now.
Right.
Not yesterday, not coming, it's here now. How come the only thing we know about environment is when they came and painted fish on our sewer grades?
Right. And Maurice, let me go to, and thank you for that, and too, because that's important to know that background. Professor Roane, for you, what's like your working definition of environmental justice, and so that it's not perceived as what many people still to this day refer to as white people's work. You know, like that's what Maurice Sampson was saying earlier. Even back then they were calling it that, but even to this day, even with a lot more awareness around how significant and how crucial this issue is in relation to especially Black communities, Black and brown communities, how do we make that definition more workable and relevant for those communities that are the most impacted? And that's why you created Black Ecologies Initiative.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here with these folks and having this conversation. I'm really focused around two issues in relation to environmental justice, and I think they're related. The first being food sovereignty, and the second being the cessation of fossil fuel use. Those are the two primary prongs that are of interest to me. And I think in all of not only in the African American communities, but also in indigenous communities within this country, and then Black communities around the diaspora, these are two primary issues. And I think they are, of course, highly related to one another. How we feed ourselves primarily in the current moment is oil driven. And so those things are related. I think for me, environmental justice really has to include all of the kinds of issues that have already been laid out on the table. In 1970, Nathan Hare, as early as 1970, Nathan Hare was talking about Black ecology as something that requires us to think about housing, that requires us to think about schools, that requires us to think about a totalizing view of social and economic relations to truly understand environmental justice. And I think we have to push back against the kind of whitening of environmental justice. Much of that, first of all, does not get rid of some of the primary relations of domination that created the world that we currently inhabit. Yeah. So I think conservationism, for example, starts in the context of the British Empire. It really does. It really is driven by the desire to maintain forests in Southeast Asia and other sections of the world to later exploit them, right? Not to undo the kinds of relationships of environmental domination, racial domination that go hand in hand. So for me, and I think Black communities have always been sources of vital knowledges that counter these tendencies towards domination and dominion. I think, since at least slavery, right? Black communities have fought against enclosure, have fought against this sort of, often in furtive, small ways, have created sustainable forms of life in the context in which, for example, plantation owners sought simply to just extract more and more wealth from land. So I think those kinds of practices in Black communities aren't just the kind of informal, but we have June Jordan in the early 1970s, along with Buckminster Fuller, was proposing some of the things that that Majora Carter is talking through in relation to Harlem, right? Building a sustainable new Harlem that would have included and not displaced anyone, but which also included a green corridor. Or Fannie Lou Hamer and food justice in the early 1970s, creating a pig bank in Ruralville, Mississippi. So I think we have the whitening of environmental justice is actually it's taken a lot of work to make it that way, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go around the round table, go to Majora too, because you went a little bit into this in your presentation earlier before this panel, your keynote presentation, and I want to have an opportunity to get this from all three of you, but I'll start with Majora. Like, what prompted you to get into that environmental justice work, right? What was it like that moment? I don't know, maybe when you were a young person, you saw something, you experienced something that said, okay, this is what I want to get into. This is what I want to lead in. The space I want to make a change in. Majora?
Yeah. So first of all, thank both of you for I'm so glad I got to follow you, because you just gave me so much food for thought. And, I got into it, because again, I was one of the kids, like a smart kid from a community like the South Bronx, led to believe you got to leave. And I did use education to get out. And when I came back home, because I was broke and I was going to grad school and I need at NYU and need a cheap place, which was my parents' house. Literally, that is the only reason why I came back home. But that's when the city and state were trying to pull off this huge waste facility, an additional waste facility. And I had this, and it was a very particular moment where it was just like, wait a second, I can pretend that I don't see this and nobody would blame me. Because I'm the smart Black girl, from the South Bronx who did good for herself. She's getting a graduate degree. She can get out of here. No one's expecting me to stay. But I was just like, I can't not. Look at what's happening. Look at what's already happened. And now we're being told that we're going to just not even feel the impacts of another 5,000 truck trips a day. We're like, seriously? And so I was just like, so that's literally when I started. But to your points, James and Maurice, this whole whitening of the environmental movement, it's just like, all of, like, whether we're from the Caribbean or from down south, like the land was something that was so much a part of what we did. My father's sister in our little backyard, who lives upstairs from us, up in the South Bronx, she had a little plot in our backyard, but she would grow herbs that she would give to us when we got sick. Before there was anything, before my mother went to the doctor, she called Aunt Marie. Like two of my favorite, people in the world, Frank and Audrey Peterman, literally wrote books about the legacy of people of color on the national park system here in this country. From, for Black folks, Latinos, Native Americans, all of us had something to do with what is considered like the last bastion of white hope. But that is like just the personification, of how effective white supremacy actually is. Like, it literally forces us leads us to believe that somehow our legacy on the land, that our understanding of the way that the environment feeds us or could feed us is something that belongs to white people. Like, it's just mind-boggling. But every single day, like, I'm touched with that, and it just drives me completely insane. So yeah, it's like, I remember when I started as an environmental justice activist, and white folks, they would love to have me come talk at their shows, and they'd call me the environmental justice activist. And I was real quick to say, I'm an environmentalist, just like you. You might do conservation. I do environmental justice, which is as valid a part of the environmental movement as conservation is. Thank you very much. So stop trying to like ghettoize me and everything that we do. No, you need us even more than you think we do. You
Right,
do.
right. Maurice, I can remember that moment in my childhood where I became very aware of my surroundings, the environment around me. When I became very concerned about the state of the environment, I just couldn't articulate it as an
Mhm.
environmental justice moment or an environmental justice issue. And so, Maurice, what was that moment for you?
Well, I mean, I was in high school at the time, and
Mm,
I went to an all-white high school in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, when it was a very white community,
Mm.
mm,
and didn't have any realization of how isolated I was, literally until I got married. I moved to Mount Airy, New Jersey, and Mount Airy, Philly, and learned what it was like to live in a Black and integrated community. I didn't understand until I had my children.
Huh. Wow.
I had no idea I was as isolated as I was. And when I was 16, I always tell people, I see the world from here out, not from out in.
right.
My father used to frequently say, you don't even know you're Black, which terrified me because I didn't know what he meant until really very recently. But I got involved in the environment because I was 16. I was looking for something to do with my life. I was looking for the right cause and seeing nothing better than to save the world was as big as the cause as it came.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I got into it. I also grew up next to an apple orchard. And this was the white flight area where everybody was coming, where I was, okay? Cherry Hill was orchards and open space. Well, I lived at the top of a watershed. I spent all my time in the woods there. It was only later, that the rest of these items came into me. So I really came into this from a love of the environment, a love of the natural areas. Hey, my grandfather was a farmer too, so that's also deep in my roots. And it wasn't until they wanted to develop that particular ground that I really joined the movement as a NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I worked from ages 17 to 23 to save that piece of ground, which is open today, 40 years later. So, my experience in the environment, it really was from a traditional environmental point of view. I was recruited by Charles Lee and Ben Chavis, and I met Bernice Miller back then too, into the environmental justice movement in 1991 when the first People of Color Congress. At the time, they described me as having a legitimate background because I was the one there that had the environmental studies degree and all the years in it already, even at that point in time. I mean, I saw this start even much earlier. There was Minorities Organized for Renewable Energy in 1978. So like so many other things, we were there long before. And one last point I'll make and let you go on, but if you look at how the environmental movement started in the Nixon administration, it would have been a very different thing had it started with Democrats, because Gaylord Nelson, if you listen to any of his old speeches, was talking about the importance of looking at Vietnam, poverty, and people. It would have had a different start. It probably would have started with an environmental sustainability focus instead of a monetizing environmental cleanup from the very beginning and turning it into, it's been a failure. I mean, environmental law was designed to clean everything up by 1984, that we have to reinvent the whole thing. And environmental justice is the reinvention.
It's funny, I'd read about that recently too, how Nixon, he didn't even know what the EPA was. He wasn't really familiar with how it was going to work. It's just he knew it was something that he felt forced to do, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which has been completely dismantled and deconstructed. It's just an agency, a name only. Professor, you write in this really beautiful, eloquent essay in Transformations magazine recently. It's entitled Black Ecologies, Tidewater, Virginia. And I'm just quoting you here. My senses of seeing and writing about matters of place were configured in rural Tidewater, Virginia, where people invoke a different register of temporality in their negotiation of territory. Structures consumed by fire long ago are regularly and casually invoked to orient someone in need of directions. And this landscape in which I was reared, inhabited by the past and present, offers me a narrative frame to examine Black ecologies and the complex interplay of Black death and Black vitality. Expound on that, because you talk about those first moments being a young person, being a young Black man growing up in rural Virginia. And I can kind of connect with that a little bit. My family, my mother's family being from Virginia, and I had to, make those occasional summer trips or spring trips down there. But talk about that and how that brought you to this moment now where you're talking about Black ecologies. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with an abiding appreciation for the landscape of the Tidewater, and I've subsequently had to unlearn the idea that it was a pristine landscape. That took me a long time to realize that farms and fields, farm fields, and tree farms are sites of extraction, violent extraction, and not just simply green and it's wonderful. But I grew up with a real attention to the kind of slow processes of the water and the landscapes in that area. And I carried that forward with me. I went to an environmental high school for 11th and 12th grade in high school,
wow.
The Chesapeake Bay Governor's School.
They actually have those. I didn't realize. I didn't realize they had environmental high schools, right?
They have one in the Tidewater.
Wow.
We focus. It's a three. It's what Virginia calls governor schools. So it's supposed to get you dual enrollment credit. And I really enrolled for that. Like I need, much like Majora was discussing, it was like I grew up in a community in a whole town that either you leave or you're stuck, right? People don't view it as a place that you can live in a kind of meaningful way, especially if you're Black. I think really the kind of definitive moment for me activating all of that information was Katrina in 2005. I was a second year undergraduate, and it just struck me like everything that I had grown up kind of understanding and knowing about the interface between water and land, but also just like a growing budding political consciousness erupted in that moment with watching thousands of people, stranded by the government on their roofs, clamoring for necessary aid and water and all of that. And I haven't been able to push any of that back down since. So I think like there's a book to be written at some point about a kind of Katrina cohort of radicalization around the environment, because at least 3 or 4 other people who I know, who I do this work with, including Dr. Justin Hosby at Emory, we were all activated in this kind of way by Katrina. So I would say that that's primarily my...
That was a tipping point.
Yeah, that was my tipping point.
That was a tipping point. When we are, Marjorie, I think this is very important. I appreciate this conversation, right, or that portion of the conversation that we're having this hour, because I think it's important for listeners to hear, for people who are tuning into this discussion, to hear like, okay, how this leadership starts, and that it took place or it manifested during very personal moments, very emotional moments for all of you, to show that this is not just something that's an academic exercise. This is something very personal, very emotional, something very moving. Once again, environmental injustice is an attack on our spaces, the spaces that we live in and the spaces that we eat off. And I want to ask you all about how much is the racism worsening as a result of the distressed and deteriorating state of the environment? Majora, because I think people need to make that connection, because, like you see in the recent election, you see polls of Black voters who were listing racial injustice as their top concern and priority for obvious reasons, right? Because of the moment that we're in. But it's interesting, most of us probably haven't made that direct linkage with the state of the environment. The state of the environment, climate crisis, for example, like what you said, Professor, with Hurricane Katrina, that makes the racism worse. That makes the racial injustice worse. But go ahead, Majora.
Yeah, I don't think the racism was ever not there. Right. I think what we have now is just, whether it's social media and the way the media is picking up on it, is that folks actually feel licensed to bare their souls in ways that I think it wasn't. People just felt like you just didn't do it. to that extent. I mean, there is, after a while, you know, it's true. You're so used to being like, you know, smacked around, you just kind of get used to it. And I know, I'll be the first to admit, I know I kind of just expected it. It's like, I'm a Black woman trying to do this work. You know, I'm a Black woman being an environmentalist, and then a Black woman going into real estate. Oh yeah, I like a challenge. You know, but it is what it is. But I do think that now folks are really like feeling like, no, and we absolutely owe it to ourselves and to everybody else, you know, our people, as well as like, and other folks owe it to us to recognize that everybody's been complicit in doing what's been happening. So what I do feel a little more hopeful about right now than I did before, you know, is the fact that, you know, it does seem like it's been raised to a level of consciousness that I don't think other folks had before. Now, the question is, how are we going to take full advantage of that in support of our communities?
That's right. That's
right. That's all I'm worried about.
Right. How do we act on it? Yeah, Marie's going to you on that. Like, how do we help people make that linkage, right? So then we can start acting on it. You know, this is now we're going to get into the call to action portion of this conversation, where people are realizing that everything environmental intersects with all these issues that we see right now, all these tragedies that are before us. And this is why we have to act on this. This is why we have to move on this. I mean, you can make the argument that environmental injustice is at the core of all these different troubles and issues that are ailing us, that are plaguing us as a people.
You know, I think that one thing that we do, funny, because this comes right out of my early training and education with this stuff, there is no separation between people and the environment. We are part of the environment. We act as if we landed here from outer space and it's not for it. It's all the same thing. To me, racism is just a social manifestation of how we've treated the planet. That, you know, we own the place, that we have to start by, it's empowerment that has to happen. It's what Majora is doing. I was so just blown away by your presentation, Majora. I came in the middle because that's where we need to go. It's about developing a love for the place and owning it and making it ours, you know, and transforming it. In nature, they talk about rewilding a place because we can't go back to natural. Well, it's that rewilding experience we're doing in our own community. You know, as I have spent my time, I always tell people, you know, I didn't grow up in the underserved community. I didn't grow up there. I'm discovering it. That in my work that I'm doing right now, I have to understand Philadelphia, and I have to understand how people are living here. So I've been exploring it in ways that I never have in the 30 plus years that I've lived here. And as I'm finding out, people love their neighborhoods. They love their communities. They don't want to leave. They want the communities for themselves. And it really is about empowering and learning that you have power and that you can take possession of this place. You need to not believe what you're being told you have to have or you can't do. And it starts right there. It starts right there. And you own it, and you want to live in a place that is healthy, that is clean, that is attractive. You want to bring nature back, that landfill, that dump that Majora turned back into a park.
That's right.
That's an expression of love for the place.
Yeah.
The action of cleaning it up and turning it is an expression. And you see it everywhere. It's happening all over right now. The big fight is who is going to own movements, because it's happening. It's going to happen whether we do it or it's done to us. It's going to happen. It is happening now. And that we need to understand that we need to vote, that we need to own our locations. And environment, it's all of its environment, okay? The fact that we see environmental justice as something we need to deal with is just a redefining of things that were said in the Black liberation time. It's just using new words to describe the same circumstances. That's what I've observed over the last 30 years. There hasn't been much that's new. You invoked Buckminster Fuller. I had a chance to meet Buckminster Fuller. He was one of my founding heroes in the work that I was doing, because he knew how to see. And it really is about becoming woke, you know? It's about becoming woke. It's about saying, this is mine and I'm going to make it mine. I'm going to take care of here. Because there is no such place as away. You can't leave. All you can do is go and take whatever you had and it comes right with you. And where you are becomes where you were. And that's what's happening with everybody on this planet right now. That is, you know, this whole capitalism thing started by deciding that only people who could be bought and sold were black. You know, in the 1400s, you know, it all began there. And the basis of European wealth is that they got it from us for free for so many times, and that's over. And we have to reclaim it. We have to decide that we're going to make where we are ours, and we're going to build the standard of life we want here. We're going to clean up the mess because you can't get away from it.
And, you know, and in talking about that too, when we get to that point where we, you know, finally make that stand, where we resolve to own the spaces that we're in, Professor, what is that advice that you would give to, you know, that young, impressionable brother or sister who is looking at what's happening around them, the space that's happening around them, and this might be something that they want to get, they don't know how to exactly articulate it, but, you know, how to get involved, right? Especially these days in that movement, in that environmental justice movement. And it's much more than environmental justice, right? It's like what Maurice was saying. Everything is all environment, it's all intertwined. So what is that advice? And I'll go around the table too. Like, what's that entry point to get involved in a movement or to create a movement yourself, to lead in this?
I think that there are plenty of ways to get involved, and I think we need all hands on deck. I mean, we're at a critical point where, of course, the polar ice caps are melting. You know, coronavirus and deforestation is bringing new viruses and bacteria into circulation in human populations. That's about deforestation for industrial farming, where it's very clear that the kind of politics of oil are tied to imperial violence, and also the violence of both the processing of petroleum, and we know Cancer Alley and all of these other kinds of spaces. We need all hands on deck. I think we need artists, we need activists and organizers, we need intellectuals, we need everyone to be doing this kind of work. And I think that kind of openness allows for people to bring their skills. And I think ordinary Black people have been engaged in the kind of mutual aid networks that we need to build new kinds of infrastructures. I mean, in Virginia, since slavery, but up through now, poor Black people in my community would not have food if they didn't look out for each other, right? I mean, there's never been a kind of moment where us feeding one another and looking out for each other in those kinds of ways haven't been critical. I think we also have to, back to this earlier question of how we are connecting all of the dots. I think one of the things that we really need to do in terms of activating consciousness about the environment in relation to racism is actually activate some of the histories of slavery that Maurice was discussing. Slavery was an environmental catastrophe. First of all, if you look at what happened in the West African context with the state formations that were created in response to growing Atlantic trade, you get the kind of shift from Sahel cities to coastal cities, and with that, massive deforestation and the transformation of those landscapes. In the context of the Middle Passage, you get large. I mean, there's all kinds of accounts of large, deep water sharks that follow ships all the way to Jamaica, right? So there's a whole re-scrambling of people, place, and environment that happens in that context. And then, of course, plantation labor, right? We were the bodies that were tasked through starvation and the whip to clear forests and to replant all of that with monoculture, right? With tobacco in Virginia, with cotton, sugar, all of the indigo, all of the kinds of those kinds of crops. Wow. So I mean, as we're talking about, and as we're seeing the kind of mainstreaming of radical abolition when it comes to incarceration, and people connecting the dots there back to slavery, I think we can do a similar kind of work around the environment. I think we must, and I think we also have to see those kinds of points as connected. I think, you know, when we talk about ecological catastrophes, prisons are ecological catastrophes, right? When we, you know, in Virginia, they blow the tops off of mountains like they used to for coal to put prisons. I think also the oil industry funds policing organizations, right? There's a significant amount of work that shows that the oil industry is invested in prisons and jails and the military, and of course the military, right? And so I think part of how we can recenter environmentalism as not white, as not any of those things, and tie it to these kinds of histories is by really returning to these kind of originary moments, and think about when dominion was articulated, what that meant, that European settlers said, this land is mine, and then needed people to work it. And that, I think, you know, we've seen the emergence of the Anthropocene, at least in terms of the ways that we discuss in academic circles, the Anthropocene discussion, right? Where all of a sudden, all of us are equally responsible for the destruction of the planet. For the first time, we equal. But I think there are other frameworks to help us think through that, like racial capitalism, like people's, Francois Verge's, or Plantationocene, other visions that help us to really actually think about, when does this epical moment of ecological destruction begin? And so I'm not sure I'm hitting the target of your question, but I'm kind of talking.
No, you are, because I never thought about it like that, and I'm sure a lot of other folks who are listening have never thought about it like that, about how we tie this to that history of enslavement of our ancestors, and how that could prompt people, that could push people to think about this differently. We actually have to now have to go to break. Unfortunately, we have to end this conversation. I had to give Professor J.T. Roane the last word on this. I could go another hour or two with this conversation, to be honest with you, because it's very fascinating. So at some point, we're going to make another hour or two on this program and others. We've been talking with Majora Carter, who's an urban revitalization strategist, MacArthur Fellow and Peabody Award-winning broadcaster. The Majora Carter Group, go to majoracartergroup.com for more information. You gave us a wonderful presentation earlier on, and I'm supposed to get a copy of that PowerPoint as a point of reference, and we can share it with our word listening audience. Also, you just heard from Professor J.T. Roane, founder of the Black Ecologies Initiative at Arizona State University. Go to ihr.asu.edu/black-ecologies for more information there. And I suspect Professor Roane will be a regular guest here on WRD, especially on Reality Check and on our EcoWURD programming. And we've been talking to Maurice Sampson, Philly-based grassroots environmental activist, strategist, unsustainable waste management expert, and chair of the Recycle Now Philadelphia campaign. He's been joining us here on EcoWURD, our Environmental Justice Summit, on our Pioneers of the Environmental Justice Movement. We didn't have enough time to discuss all this, but definitely very, very moving at the end, Professor. You gave me some food for thought there, and how we all need to look at this a lot differently. And then, Majora, I see comments from your presentation earlier in our Facebook Live Word TV section, people saying self-gentrification, that's the way to go. They had a major moment, like an aha moment, a nirvana moment that just happened during your presentation. And Maurice Sampson, as always, great to have your perspective here on WURD. Just very inspiring work that you're doing in Philadelphia, in the Delaware Valley and beyond. So it's really been a pleasure and an honor to be joined by all three of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Honor to be with you.